and programming. Some of you here will recall or know that in the 1960s, one of the important aspects of electronic art in New York were organizations like the Electric Circus, where we had these projections that would fill walls, and we had a kind of light shows. I took my gestural brushstrokes, and with projectors and electronic programming, synchronization, I would use several projectors and created an environment also with sound and original soundtracks, which I don't have today. And you can get an example of how this was set up with students in one of my exhibitions. So now for the transition from art idea guiding hand to art idea guiding machine. I took a course in Fortran at the Control Data Institute in 1970 and became deeply interested in how, let me see if I can get this covered. I'm trying. I seem to have trouble with this. Somebody can help. Here we go. That should work. Did I get it? Yeah, sorry about that. There we go. I think this dates from 1969. This dates from 1969, and it was taken at UNIVAC, the footage from the monitor at UNIVAC, and presented on public television along with a lecture presented on medieval art. The reason I'm showing it is to say how tremendously moved I was by the capability of how shall I say, of a computer or an algorithm to generate this kind of movement to infinity and back. And that grabbed my imagination. I thought to myself, for all the things that I was interested in, could I write the code for form generators and in some ways go after the very same things I went after as a painter and translate them into code? And that is what has occupied me for the past 30 or so years. Some of my early work was the magic hand of chance, and I'm going to try to reconstruct my magic hand of chance and distribute it soon on my webpage. But the magic hand of chance could generate visuals, titles, the sayings of Umphalis. I structured a dictionary with verbs, adjectives, nouns, and pronouns, and wrote some kind of syntax so that it would generate bits of pieces of sayings and so forth. So this would give you an example of the kind of thing that occupied me in the early 1980s. Often the way I worked, sayings of Umphalis. Okay, this is one example. It's non-rational. The awkward caprice occasionally advances. Wiggle ferociously whenever caprice wagers. This is very interesting. It's almost like what the Dada artists did in the 1920s, where I could use a pseudo-randomizer in the computer to choose words from dictionary, verbs, adverbs, with the syntax, and generate very interesting passages. So at least in those days, that fascinated me. We also had it generate various kinds of forms that would go through cycles and continue without repeating itself over a long period. Well, theoretically, probably it would be quite a bit. In fact, it would be massive. I don't know the correct term, but this gives you an idea. So when I acquired my own pen plotter drawing machine, I was able to take pretty much the same kind of logic originally and generate these kinds of drawings. What's interesting about them, these were algorithmic drawings that have, in and of themselves, a kind of an inner logic, because there's a self-similar structure. This isn't not self-similar in the sense of a fractal structure, but in another way, pretty much the way I thought about it as a painter. And I, essentially, for those of you who do program, I essentially do something like set parameters, not more than and not less than, for various aspects of the procedure. They have to do essentially with I work essentially with a Cartesian grid, and I use just plane geometry. So it's essentially angle, sine, cosine, structuring positions, and doing that in ways that over a period of time could get rather sophisticated. The other thing that's interesting was my efforts to translate the brush and ink work of the early 1960s into algorithmic brushstrokes. So my code-driven physical brushstroke of you see here, 1989, is one of 125 that were generated from my limited edition on George Bull. So this is one of a kind in a family of forms that included approximately, I would say, 125 original front and end pieces to introduce the derivation of laws by George Bull, who in a sense was the father of, considered by many to be the father of modern symbolic logic. Circuit board structures, the logic of circuit boards are evolved or come from the procedures that are rooted in symbolic logic. So I was very interested in the pioneers of whose work contributed importantly to the information revolution, and this included, of course, the work of George Bull, Alan Turing, and Norbert Wiener. I won't have time to show all of those, but this gives you an idea of how I structured, in any event, the frontispieces for the George Bull edition. So all of this code was set originally with one set of parameters as a parent code, and consequently was able to generate 125 one of a kind in that series. So I think it may be the first time we ever had a bound edition of this type. But this is a 6-foot piece that I had shown in Seagrove in Dallas in 1990. And still remains interesting to myself because of the structure. It's the kind of structure that the entire structure itself has about 10 or 15 sets of control points, let's say XY positions, that are, and the relationship of these coordinates is the basis for generating the entire structure. And that becomes pretty obvious when you start to look at it more carefully. Other works of mine might be our efforts to bring together geometric structures and spontaneous automatic structures in the same field. They may or may not be quite so successful, but they, in one sense, carry out what I had tried to do in my painting. I have to say, since then, of course, I've come to understand a lot more, and I don't work that way now. I'm much more interested in what I'm able to do with a pen plotter in and of itself. This is part of a series of what I call algorithmic poetry that I showed last year in Dom in Berlin. And the brushstrokes, by the way, are all represented in the calligraphy in the left column, so that one can see that they are indeed algorithmically generated paintings. I think what I'll do is pass on going further into my Diamond Lake Apocalypse, but just to give you an idea that manuscript illumination was of great interest to me, and I always like to believe that these kinds of structures in one way point to how it is that the new authorities that we might like to illuminate and stress in the way we illuminated medieval manuscripts, these, in my mind, represent an effort to illuminate the procedures that dominate today's culture, namely algorithmic procedures. So these are just a few variations of the kinds of form that I have worked with over the years. Always the gold work is by hand, but all brushwork and all pen strokes are, of course, driven by code driven. My series on visions of Hildegard were my effort to show how it is that we are able to generate a series of forms from a single parent code, a kind of generative art. Perhaps this is a primitive form and an early type, but it is something that has occupied me a great deal. Gold is always by hand, of course. The 26 visions, because Hildegard had 26 visions, as it were, historically. The literature contains that. I'll quickly pass a couple major projects. What I call the growth of form and I was thinking of Darcy Thompson's work when I gave it that title. And there are 11 improvisations here based on a single set of coordinates. And this is at the University of St. Thomas Science and Engineering Center in St. Paul. It's about a year's work, actually. Some of those pieces could take up to 2 weeks of pen plotting. And the brushstroke you see there is the one that dominates, that contains all the information that's used for all the other pieces. It's in a sense a kind of syngraphy, if one thinks of a symphony. At least that was in my mind. Some alternatives to my so-called Diamond Lake Apocalypse are also my Pearl Park Scriptures, which were shown in Berlin a few years back. And they all include text and some kind of illumination. The text, again, are algorithmic text. In some instances, my texts are coordinated with kind of translations of actual text. In other instances, they're non-rational texts. In any event, they're intended to be something like a scripture that speaks to the language speaks to the fact, from my point of view anyway, of code that underlies a lot that happens in our culture. Like just as we speak now, probably in New York, stock is being exchanged on the basis of algorithmically driven programs. So that's a little bit frightening. This is my project for the University of Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky. There are 7 cyber flowers with text from various sort of fields of learning. In this instance, the text is from Homer. Many of these texts were chosen by my wife. The Flowers of Learning, anyway, included one for Homer and various scholars. You can download the catalog from my website. I wanted to show a couple details because currently I'm working on transformations or putting